Okay, so tonight I want to introduce to you Audrey Voth-Petka. She is the president of Tour Imagination, the travel company that has been sponsoring and collaborating with the 8 museums and archives who are part of this virtual tour. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you, Sandra. Good evening, everyone. And I want to thank you for spending some time with us this Tuesday evening in Tour Imagination's 50th anniversary celebration week. Exciting. Welcome to our 6th presentation in our virtual tour webinar series. Tonight's presentation is The Anabaptist Story Lives On. So let me introduce you to Joel Alderfer. Since 1988, Joel has worked as curator, librarian, and as collections manager at the Mennonite Heritage Center in Harleysville, Pennsylvania. Over the past 40 years, he has done much genealogical and local history research in Bucks and Montgomery counties in Pennsylvania. In the last 3 decades, in his role as collections manager at the center, Joel has done extensive research in documenting the material culture, including Fraktur, furniture, textiles, manuscripts, and rare books of Mennonite communities in eastern Pennsylvania. As curator, he has created numerous exhibits on various themes from the local and broader Mennonite story. He lives in Harleysville, Pennsylvania, and is a member of Salford Mennonite Church. Welcome, Joel. We look forward to your presentation.
Okay. So I'm glad to be with you tonight. I've been looking forward to this evening of sharing a few stories from the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite tradition and heritage. And tonight we'll be looking at the Mennonite Heritage Center and its Fraktur collection. I'll start with a brief introduction to our facility and our programming here, and then we'll move into more stories and information from our Fraktur collection. So the Mennonite Heritage Center was built in 1990, opened here in the fall of that year. The building has architectural elements of a meeting house and barn. The long front porch leads to the front door, and the porch is reminiscent of the porches on some of our early meeting houses in this area. So that takes you into our front entrance. In 2013 and 14, we reconstructed a traditional Pennsylvania bank barn on our campus. So that's another feature of our campus. It's used for some of our own events, our larger events like our fall festival, the Apple Butter Frolic, but we also let it out for rentals, mostly wedding and reception rentals. But back to the Heritage Center. Once you step inside the Mennonite Heritage Center, our tall lobby that you see as you enter is basically 2 stories high, and that's a great place for displaying quilts of all sorts, both contemporary quilts, as we have recently had here, and historic quilts from our own collection. Also, coverlets and other large textiles are sometimes displayed on these high walls where people can't touch them, but they can be fully opened. This particular collection of quilts was from contemporary art quilts by a local Mennonite-related artist, and that exhibit was here before COVID-19 shut us down. Another view of our main lobby, looking from up on the balcony. And again, it's an area that's great for displaying quilts up high, and then for our receptions and public events that we have in the lobby and surrounding rooms. The quilts we're looking at here, some of these, this one here is from about 1850. This is from the 1880s, this one's from the 1880s, and it's in like new condition. And these are just a few of the many quilts, historic quilts we have in our collection. Then going down to the other end of our building into the museum exhibit end, again, it's to the peak of the ceiling there, it's basically 3 stories high, but it gives you the open feel of a barn frame. In fact, that's what we had in mind when we designed it. The beams there, which are structural, give the feel of a barn frame. But this area on both sides of this space are for exhibits. On the left, in the past, we've had changing exhibits, and here on the right is more of our longer term exhibits. Right now, we have in that space, and that will be here till early next year, an exhibit that looks at food heritage of Eastern Pennsylvania. It's the entrance to the exhibit. So we looked at 5 different centuries of food heritage, starting with 17th century Lenape people, taking it through the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century, local food heritage and practices and traditions. Here's the corner that shows the 18th century food traditions and 19th century Pennsylvania Dutch food traditions. 3 years ago, we did a major exhibit celebrating the 300th anniversary of the first major migration or immigration of Mennonites to Pennsylvania. At that point, 1717, coming entirely mostly from the Palatinate, people of Swiss and German background coming from the Palatinate. But for that exhibit in 2017, we told mainly the stories of early immigration and early settlement here, but we also wanted to hear a bit more about recent immigrant stories. So we did have some story panels of stories collected from recent immigrants into our Mennonite community. And then as a part of that time, we invited and were able to host several church groups that were made up of recent immigrant groups. And here was a group from one of our Indonesian Mennonite churches in Philadelphia. And most of these people are fairly recent immigrants. So they had an interesting time with us and we with them, hearing each other's, immigration stories. Theirs recent and ours, much older. But it was an interesting time to compare stories and just to see how they responded to what we were trying to show in the exhibit. And then another church from South Philadelphia, one of our recent congregations, a Hispanic church, another Sunday afternoon we hosted a bus load. We helped to arrange to bring a bus load here. And so here one of our volunteers is showing the children from that congregation, telling them a little bit about early Mennonite immigration to Pennsylvania. Another room off of our lobby, we call our welcome center, and this is a place where we have a little coffee machine. People can sit and have coffee and visit after they've gone through the exhibits, or if a family member is taking longer in the exhibits, they can sit down and have a break. We also have a small museum store, a gift and bookshop here in that room as well. Our meeting room, or meeting house room as we call it, off the lobby, is a place where we hold various programs throughout the year and where we show our introductory video that any visitor, 1 or 2 or 50 visitors, can see if they want. Here we were having this was one of a series of hymn sings we had, 4 or 5 years ago, singing our way through the old Mennonite hymnal at that time, before it was, pretty much put to rest by most of our congregations. In another space, we have our local Mennonite history exhibit. We call it Work and Hope, Mennonite Life in Eastern Pennsylvania. And so this is basically a chronological arrangement of major themes from our local Mennonite story. Here, this display is talking about 19th century Menishta Land. So that's Pennsylvania German, that's dialect for Mennonite land. And that was a term that some Mennonites who lived a little further away from the center, a little further north, referred to the heavily populated Mennonite area down here in central Montgomery and Bucks as Menishta Land. Another view of that exhibit: quilts, clothing, meeting house, artifacts, photographs. In the middle here is a fairly authentic model, fairly accurate model of one of our early meeting houses and older meeting houses in Bucks County. Our historical library, another main aspect of our program, houses a fairly good collection of reference books on local history, Mennonite, Anabaptist history, faith and life, Pennsylvania German history and culture, genealogy, of course, peace, non-resistance, and studies on pacifism, mission history. It's not a large space, but we have a number of nice library tables for doing research. In this photo, John Ruth happens to be here doing research on, this is 5 years ago, on some project or other. In 2010, 10 years ago, we named the library in honor of John Ruth. So it's the John L. Ruth Historical Library. There's been sometimes when we've had several researchers working on different congregational histories or local history projects. So we've had some busy times, and then there's some slower times. At this particular time, there were 3 or 4 different researchers working on significant local and congregational history projects that particular summer. Back in the vault, as we call it, our storage area for the collections that are more rare or fragile, the things we don't have out in the reference stacks in the library. In the vault, we have on the right our museum collection storage. You can't see much of that here. It looks far more impressive when things are well arranged in exhibits out in the exhibit galleries. Here on the left is our rare book section. And it's a little bit closer, some of our rare books. Books used or owned or written or published or read by Mennonites and their families. The manuscript collections are personal papers. Ministerial collections are another section of the library. And then we'll jump out to go out to the Fraktur gallery again off of our lobby. And now I'll start focusing in on our Fraktur collection. So the Fraktur gallery, 10 years ago, we named in honor of Mary Jane Ledrock Hershey, who was one of our founders, along with John Ruth. But Mary Jane, over the last 3 or 4 decades, has done considerable research and writing and publishing on the local Mennonite Fraktur tradition. So we named the gallery, the Fraktur Gallery, in honor of her. In the front here, we have some reproduction students' desks and schoolmaster desks from about the early 1840s from a schoolhouse in Bucks County. And so children that may come in with families or even homeschool groups can sit here and do a couple activities like work on the slates or do some coloring sheets of color reproductions or photocopies of old drawings. And then on the walls, we have, from time to time, we change this too. Every 6 to 8 months, we change this with selections from our Fraktur collection. On the one wall here, we have mainly a group of printed and hand-colored or color printed birth and baptismal certificates, or in German, Tauf und Geburtsschein. These particular ones are all from Mennonite families. Generally, the Taufschein, or birth and baptismal certificates, were used by the church people, as we called them, the Lutheran and the Reformed church folks who practiced infant baptism. So you would have this document, very important for most families, where you recorded the birth and baptism of the child. But some Mennonite families used them as well and would often just record the birth of the child. Another view of the Fraktur gallery. We have a couple of our finest or rarest pieces of furniture in this gallery as well. Some of these pieces hanging on the wall here, and I assume you can see my cursor. Audrey or Sandra, can you see my cursor moving?
Yes, that's right,
okay,
we can.
Good. So these pieces back here are known as Vorschriften, or writing models, writing samples done by schoolmasters for their students. And some of the pieces hanging on this wall are from the 1770s, 1780s. So they're rare early pieces. Now I'll get into some specific pieces of Fraktur in our collection. And And I'll read from a narrative that I put together mainly, and tell some of the stories behind these pieces. So we have a 1536 edition of the Froschauer Bible, printed in Zurich, Switzerland, by Christopher Froschauer, one of the early printers, publishers of the Swiss Reformation. And here's the title page to the second part of the Bible. The first title page, the main title page, is missing. This is not strictly the title page for the New Testament either. The Froschauer Bible was a little differently arranged than Martin Luther's translation. So this title page tells us it's for the other part of the Old Testament and with all of the new, or the entirety of the New Testament, 1536. Gedruckt, they're printed in Zurich by Christopher Froschauer. But on the left-hand side of the page is an early European bookplate showing a Mennonite ownership of the Bible from 1708. Froschauer's Bible was a favorite, or the favorite version of the early Swiss Anabaptist, but it was forbidden, at least in Baronese territory, it was forbidden by the authorities, and if found, it was confiscated from Anabaptist families. And there are stories of Anabaptists hiding these Froschauer Bibles in their haymows and feed troughs or under floorboards. In the 1690s, this Bible was owned by and inscribed by members of the prominent Anabaptist Schnabely or Snavely family, who had originated from near Zurich, but now lived at the Ebersheimer Hof along the Rhine River in the Palatinate. And the text here, and I'll translate it, it says, "This Bible belongs to me, Hans Jacob Schnabely, at the Ebersheimer Hof, and was received from my father-in-law in the year 1698. As I mentioned already, it had belonged, then in 1708, it belonged to Matthias Schnabely at the Ebersheimer Hof, and this inscription reads, Diese Bibel gehört Matthias Schnabely. This Bible belongs to Matthias Schnabely auf dem Eversheimer Hof. Und sie ist im Lieb so geschrieben. We have a couple different translations of that phrase, but it seems like it's saying, and I have loved it. In the year 1708, it turns out this is one of, if not the oldest known Mennonite illuminated manuscript, and again, made in the Palatinate before this family immigrated to Pennsylvania. The Bible was brought to Pennsylvania by George and Maria Schnabely Bachman when they immigrated in about 1718 and settled in Northampton County by 1727. It remained in the Bachman family until the late 18th century. In 1778, during the American Revolution, the Bible survived the confiscations and sheriff's auctions of 12 households in the Saucon Mennonite congregation in Northampton County. 12 men, or heads of household, of the congregation had conscientiously refused to take the test oath of allegiance to the new rebel government, as they saw it, the new Pennsylvania government. And for that refusal, they were jailed briefly and had their possessions confiscated and auctioned by, in fact, an overzealous county sheriff. And that's been historically documented. After the auctions, the Bible was apparently returned to the Bachman family, or they got it back somehow, and they soon had a lovely family register made for it soon after they got it back, or soon after these confiscations happened in 1779 or 80. And here it is. The first page, the main decorated page of it is what we see. It was a 2-page folded piece that was sewn into the Bible. Turns out that it's not signed, but we know who did it based on the style of handwriting and the motifs that this artist used. But this person was a Lutheran schoolmaster, John Adam Iyer, who taught in several Mennonite community schools in central Bucks County. We think this was made maybe 1779 or 80. It had been sewn into the Bible. The Bible then descended in the Bachman Stout family for several generations until about 1910, when it was noticed by a historian and genealogist who published a translation of the family register in the Pennsylvania Genealogical Magazine, then already, 1910 and 11. It again then fell into obscurity until 1990, when it mysteriously and surprisingly appeared on, to us, very surprisingly appeared on a well-advertised catalog auction in Montgomery County here in PA. We, the Mennonite Heritage Center, bought it with the help from a number of donors. We simply had to get it and had to save it. We just could not let it go. I later met and learned the person who had consigned it to the auction house was not a local person and was in no way descended from or related to this Bachman or Stout family. They and I still don't know how their family acquired it. It was a real mystery, but at least we were able to save this incredible artifact. In 2015, with significant funding from Institute of Museum and Library Services, a federal agency, we had this priceless Bible and the family register professionally conserved. And what you're seeing here is the conserved piece. I won't go into detail here, but it was not restored. Restoration is different than conservation. This is conservation, I would say, in its best form. So in conservation, you stabilize the item, the book in this case, where it's at. You resecure things that may be loose. And this is all very highly skilled professional work. You repair spines and binding, but you don't replace anything that doesn't absolutely have to be replaced. You stabilize it where it's at. And that's what we did here with funding. This piece is a roughly 1750 foreshrift, again, a writing model that we attribute pretty confidently to Christopher Dock. Dock was an early Mennonite schoolmaster here in Eastern Pennsylvania, known for his care and love of children, and the first known author on school management in America, and one of the first practitioners of Fraktur writing. No signed pieces of his Fraktur survive, but we can attribute his work based on handwriting on surviving documents which he did sign. His lettering and decoration was generally not elaborate or fine. His English language writing here at the bottom is somewhat unique and is recognizable once you know it. This piece has a text addressed to his students. Mein lieber, the top line, mein lieber Schüler, die Zeit geht hin, wo führt sie unseren Wandel hin? My dear students, the time goes on, where are we headed? This piece, not dated from about 1770, very unusual, large piece, almost double legal size, almost ledger size. It's a drawing of Frederick II, King of Prussia. And we can date it, I'll get to that, we can date it to about 1770. There's some confusion in historical sources. This guy is sometimes called Frederick II and sometimes Frederick III. It depends how, I think historically how you analyze his descent or the naming of this in that family. But here's a color drawing by a schoolmaster in Bucks County named Johannes Meier, who was probably Lutheran, not Mennonite, but he made it for a Mennonite student, Abraham Landis, whose name is written on the back. It was passed down in that family, in the Landis family, through other marriages to other family descendants, to a descendant who donated it to us about 35 years ago. In the late 19th century, it was owned and signed by one Isaac L. Culp of Bucks County. I only mentioned that because I believe there are a couple of his descendants watching this webinar tonight. I heard they might be. It's not signed or dated by the schoolmaster, this particular piece, but a nearly identical drawing, color drawing, but in much worse condition, was found glued under the lid of a dowry chest in another local museum about 25 years ago. And that piece is signed and dated Johannes Meier, 1769. And that was a significant discovery for us, which helped to further identify Johannes Meier's hand. And you have to wonder when you look at a piece like this coming out of a Pennsylvania German Mennonite community by a German schoolmaster, what might have been the source of this image for him? Well, there's two possible sources. I think the source on the right, a printed source, is the more likely source, but on the left is a 1757 painting of Friedrich II, as he's called. I definitely see similarities there between these two, but on the right is a more local source. It's from a 1762 German language almanac of Christopher Sauer, published in Germantown, and so that was available here in Eastern Pennsylvania. We suspect that this was the image source for the drawing of Frederick the Great. Another artist who we've only learned a bit more about in the last 25 years or so, who worked in the 1780s. And here's a piece by him, by John Heinrich Brauchtheiser. The identity and the intriguing story of this young schoolmaster only began to come into focus about 25 years ago with the chance discovery of this lovely foreshrift, or again, writing model, which is signed on the back by H.B. Schuldiener auf Schippach in the year 1787. H.B. Schuldiener, literally school servant or school teacher, from Skippach or at Skippach in the year 1787. From a couple of obscure published and manuscript sources, we had learned just a few years before only the name of Heinrich Brauchtheiser, a schoolmaster of Lower Salford and Skippach in the mid-1780s. But here was a piece of Fraktur actually signed, or at least initialed, by the person who must have been that schoolmaster, based on all the evidence on the piece. With that evidence, I was able to start piecing together the previously unknown story of this Hessian mercenary who served under the British, but at the end of the American Revolution, somehow met and married a rather young Mennonite girl from Skippach, and I mean quite young, and then became a schoolmaster for a few years in the Mennonite communities here in Lower Salford and Skippach. He died of some serious illness at the age of 26 in 1788. So he was only teaching 4 or 5 years here, and he is buried in the Skippach Mennonite Cemetery. An obscure record of his death and burial found in his wife's family Bible even gives the funeral text, a text which strongly suggests that he had indeed become a member of the Skippach Mennonite congregation. This was all a very exciting discovery for us. Here's the back of it with his inscription. He says, a foreshrift for Philip Markley, verfertigt durch, or completed by H.B. Schuldiener auf Schippach, school teacher, school servant at Skippach. Here's a close-up of one of these printed and hand-colored birth and baptismal certificates. This one from a Mennonite family. This one made for Maria Latchall, who was born 1786. She grew up in the Hereford Mennonite congregation in Berks County, later married John Gaiman, whose lovely birth certificate I'll show next. It's a printed form with hand-colored decoration, and then with the inscription filled out perhaps by the same guy who did the hand coloring. Sometimes there were itinerant salesmen who bought these blank forms, colored them in by hand, and then filled them out, peddled them door to door or town to town, village to village, and filled them in for you, the parents, for the child. But these were more common among these birth and baptismal certificates were more common among the Lutheran and Reformed people. Were generally not used in Mennonite families, but some in our area did. And in fact, this one only records her birth, not her baptism. We think the piece is probably was done in about 1790, maybe a few years after her birth, but it does not record her baptism, which would have been much later, perhaps as a 16 or 18-year-old. Then here's the entirely hand-done birth certificate for her future husband, John Gaiman. He was born in 1793, again in Berks County, into a Mennonite family. It's entirely hand-drawn, but the artist apparently copied motifs from an earlier printed Taufschein, baptismal certificate. The piece is signed, I think, by the artist in abbreviated form in the lower right corner, and it says, it seems to be saying, abbreviated, Geschrieben von mir, JL. Down here, these are abbreviations for those words, I'm pretty sure, written by me, JL, but we still don't know who JL was. Haven't figured that one out yet. It features the well-known German hymn, Wer nur den lieben Gott lässt walten. This beautiful piece was passed down in the Gaiman family until 1975 when it was donated to us. Here's another one of these Vorschriften from 1793, made for Anna Kemper of Skippack. It features the text of a hymn by Christopher Dock, an earlier schoolmaster at Skippack and Salford. The hymn, as written here, it's actually a mistake. It says, Ihr Kinder wollt ihr lieben. It should read, Ach Kinder wollt ihr lieben. So the artist, Jacob Gutschall in this case, got the first word of the hymn wrong. Translation of that would be, O children who are loving, be sure to love aright. Some years after this piece was donated to us, we determined that it must be the work of Mennonite schoolmaster Jacob Gutschall. This was based on another piece that surfaced from Skippack, dated 1792, done in the same hand, which was clearly signed Jacob Gutschall, Schuldiener. Again, there's that term, a school servant or school teacher. This sign piece then helped us positively attribute to Jacob Gutschall 4 or 5 other unsigned pieces from the same years. Also exciting stuff for museum curators. Further research allowed us to notice influences from the work of Jacob's own school teacher in Bucks County, Johannes Meier, who I mentioned earlier, on his own work, and then to the work of Jacob's 2 sons, Samuel and Martin Gutschall, who later became schoolmasters themselves. Here's a piece dated 1798 by schoolmaster Andreas Kalb for his student, and the name is just here, very small, Abraham Geisinger. This again came to us directly from a descendant. It has the text, Gott fürchten, the main text at the top, Gott fürchten, lieben und ehren, soll man mit Ernst die Kinder lehren. To fear God, to love and honor him, one should diligently teach the children. Bottom left in the heart over here is the common verse found on Fraktur and also cross-stitched onto samplers and show towels found in Mennonite families. And it says, O edel Herz, bedenk dein End, wer weiß wie nah der Lauf vollend. O noble heart, consider your end. Who knows how soon the journey will end? Another interesting detail over here in the other heart, on the right-hand side, the artist made a mistake when he wrote this, here's my cursor, when he wrote this little couplet. He made a mistake with the verse, actually an omission, with the verse, Das Herze mein soll dir allein ergeben sein. He forgot the word, the second word, Herze. He forgot it, Das Herze mein, but he soon realized it, and he went back and inserted it symbolically with the heart. See the heart symbol with the E, Herze, and put a little X there to show us that he hadn't totally forgotten it. And it's in his hand. So that's a pretty neat little detail, I think. Here's a reward of merit, or a school reward, by the same artist, Andreas Kalb, probably from the late 1790s. Unfortunately, this corner of it was lost before we got it. But this says, and look at the image. This says, Die Engel Gottes werde mit Fleiß auf dein Seel warte im schönen Garten in Paradise. roughly, may the angels of God wait upon your soul with diligence in the beautiful garden of paradise. Another large or double-sized foreshrift from June 1803, and it's signed, unusually signed in English. To have it signed, to have a piece of Fraktur signed is a rare thing. Now here we have it in English. Signed by Andrew Stover, his hand and pen. Artists will often say something like that, German artists. So-and-so, his Hand und Feder. Yeah, Andrew Stover, his hand and pen, June 1803. And this piece also has the well-known hymn text, Wer nur den lieben Gott lässt walten. It came from the same family as the 1794 Johannes Meier birth certificate and his wife's certificate that I showed you earlier, very same source. I'll just look at these two pieces. Particularly, let's look at the one on the left for Jacob Kalb. Imagine receiving this as a 15-year-old Pennsylvania German student in 1814. Imagine how you might feel about that. Wouldn't you also cherish it? Jacob Kalb and his descendants took good care of it until about 1990 when they gave it to us. When I found it in their collection and opened it up, it was like looking at something new. It was incredibly bright and clear. A bookplate, it's a bookplate made by schoolmaster David Culp of Bucks County for Jacob Kalb's Mennonite hymn book, the Zion's Harfa, or Zion's Harp. It looks almost new. And on the right-hand side is another bookplate by a different teacher, a different artist, made for the same Jacob Kalb. It's an 1825 bookplate in a New Testament made for Kalb, but by a different teacher or penman 11 years later. It gives Jacob's birth date as well as the date it was made, gives his birth date. So we know he was 25 years old at the time. What we don't know is, what we'd love to know is, why was it given to him? Why, when and why did he receive it? Was it some special occasion? Those are the kinds of questions we can't often answer when it comes to the Fraktur. How and when and why were these given? These beautiful pieces, which these students and their descendants cherished. Another bookplate by the talented schoolmaster David Culp. This one here is a bookplate for a hymn tune booklet. It reads, Dieses harmonische Melodien Buchlein gehört Sarah Oberholzer, Sing Schiller in der Tiefrunner Schule. Literally, this harmonic melody booklet belongs to Sarah Oberholzer, singing scholar in the Deep Run School, 1815. It's filled with handwritten German hymn tunes and first lines. The text around the circle reads, Lerne wie du kannst allein, Singer, Buch und Tempel sein. It's hard to translate and make that rhyme, but learn how you alone can be singer, book, and temple. And that's a phrase that often appears on these decorated title pages of these hymn tune booklets. This little hymn booklet, these little hymn booklets were commonly made by teachers in the Mennonite community schools of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and almost always had a Fraktur decorated title page like this. It's essentially a title page. We have about 24 of these little hymn tune or Noten Buchlein in our collection, and they're just, each one is a treasure. By the same artist is this, I think, incredibly delicate family register from about 1815 by this David Culp, made for Henrik and Elizabeth Leatherman of Deep Run, Bucks County. Just look at this elaborate capital letter I. And what it says is, Ich namens Henrik Ledermann. So I, the named, Henrik Leatherman was born such a date, gives his marriage and the birth of all his children. On the left is a family register in a 1778 Bible for Samuel and Susanna Newcomer Landis, made by schoolmaster Rudolph Landis of Bucks County in 1815. Rudolph Landis was a teaching contemporary of David Culp's and taught in some of the same subscription schools. Landis's work was similar to Culp's, but it's not as fine and consistent. But actually, for a number of years, we were attributing some of Culp's work to Landis, since there are a couple of pieces clearly signed by Landis. Once we were finally able to identify David Culp and his style and confidently attribute more of his work, then we were able to distinguish between the two hands. Although it took a trained eye, the story of how I identified David Culp's hand and career is a little tedious. We'll just say it involved another surprising discovery from an unlikely source. On the right-hand side, from the very same Bible, another page, another family register for a later generation, dated 1887 by an itinerant scrivener, August Baumann, and he signs it at the bottom. He may have been a Jewish itinerant artist. There were several that we know of here in the mid to late 19th century here in Eastern Pennsylvania. This is 1887. But doesn't it feel very different than this one? This has much more of a Victorian feel to it. Here's two unusual, colorful pieces from the early 1820s by some teacher, until recently called simply the exotic scenery artist. And can you imagine how he or she got that name? The name given by collectors and curators, because we didn't know who else it could have been, and we still don't quite know. They're a part of a larger group of such work from our community, and we have several other pieces by this hand, by the same artist, teacher artist. We've recently found a couple of clues to his identity, but we don't have enough evidence to announce an attribution. Not yet. I'm pretty sure he was a Mennonite teacher who later was ordained a deacon in one of our local congregations. But I wonder, in our conservative Pennsylvania German Mennonite community, what would have been the source of images like this? A German almanac, perhaps? I'll show two of these notes in bookline in a row. This one from 1827 with the title page by teacher Samuel Moyer of the Deep Run School. And again, here it says singing scholar for Anna Leatherman, singing scholar in the Deep Run School, 1827. Isn't that colorful? And the next one, also by the same teacher, by Samuel Moyer, for Katharina Wismer, who's also indicated here as singing scholar in the Deep Run School, 1828. So again, this is the title page or the bookplate to this little booklet that's filled with handwritten hymn tunes and first lines of text. Here's one beautiful piece that's clearly signed and dated by the schoolmaster, Isaac Z. Hunsicker. He even used his middle initial in 1830 when he made it. The text is, Ich weiß mir ein ewiges Himmelreich. I know of an eternal heavenly kingdom. Several of Hunsicker's surviving pieces are signed and dated. And here's one of them on the left, an incredible piece, a most unusual piece, also signed and dated by Hunsicker, 1830. Isaac Z. Hunsicker, 1830, and it's titled Die Mutter Jesus. I think most of you can translate that for yourselves. Biblical personalities like this are rare on Mennonite Fraktur. On the right is the possible source of this image, a print in an 1825 Philadelphia Bible in our collection which was owned by a Skippack Mennonite family. And this particular copy in this Bible was hand colored by the owner of the Bible. This colorful hymn tune booklet was made by schoolmaster Jacob Gross of Bucks County for student John Detweiler, again saying, I just love this phrase, singing scholar, sing Schiller, in this case in der Hilltown Schule. So singing scholar in the Hilltown School in 1830. It's only in the last 10 years or so that we've been able to identify the work of Jacob Gross. We are still learning about his career and gradually attributing more work to him. Just imagine how a quiet, rural Pennsylvania German Mennonite child of 10 or 12 years would treasure this piece. Here on the left is another bookplate by Jacob Gross, 1834, made for Jacob Bishop. It records his birth date, but the date of the book, a hymn book, is actually 1834. It happens to be the Mennonite hymn book, the Zion's Harp, but there's the date of the birth of the recipient, Jacob Bishop. But here on the right, we are so fortunate to have this photograph of old schoolmaster Jacob Gross himself, taken in 1897 at the age of 90, just a few years before he died. The historian from Bucks County, Henry Mercer, who visited and photographed him, said that he was one of the last of the old German schoolmasters in Bucks County. And he interviewed him and recorded other things about him, like how he had played the sitar in the schoolroom and at home. And we're so fortunate to have this photo and that information from Henry Mercer's writing.
Joel?
But, yes.
We should probably move on to questions fairly soon.
Okay, let me finish up with this one.
Okay.
Yeah, then we'll, yeah. But looking at this man, this old man, do you think this intense looking man could have created these lovely pieces even 65 years earlier? And this one yet, this colorful piece by Samuel Gutschall, a son of the earlier schoolmaster Jacob Gutschall. This is done in 1834 in Franconia Township, and it looks like new yet. The colors are bright and shiny. These were colored inks that had some kind of additive put in them that created a shiny finish as they dried, and this one holds its original color even today. So yeah, we'll end it there and take some questions or comments. I'm not hearing you.
Those are some really beautiful pieces. Thank you for sharing them. Do you know, happen to know what type of ink they used?
Those are good questions. These were colored inks. There were some watercolors, but most of these were colored inks that the artists probably made themselves from pigments that they bought. Again, it depends what period of time we're talking about, but these pigments were available in Philadelphia or even in local country stores at some point, but they probably mixed the colors from pigments that they bought for the most part.
Julia has a question for you. Do you have any information about the creative habits, such as where did people create Frakturs, how long it would take to complete a hymn book? What were their creative influences, and did these artists ever get paid for their work?
we ask those same questions all the time. I would love to know, and I don't think we've found any evidence yet on the question of where they paid for this extra work in their teaching career. I have a feeling that they probably were. I mean, Pennsylvania German folk were not romantic people. They probably understood that this took this poor schoolmaster a little bit of time. I just have a feeling that schoolmasters received a little bit of payment for this work. That's my hunch, but I don't know that we have any evidence on that yet. And it's a
Okay.
question that many curators and historians have asked.
And
But the questions of how long these things might have taken to do, that's hard to say. The only way we can sometimes get a handle on that is where we have a prolific artist whose work who has a lot of work that has survived, and if that work, we can attribute it confidently to that one person's hand, and if that work is in a sequence of dates, and that happens occasionally with a few of these artists, where we find pieces like those hymn tune booklets I was showing, those beautiful title pages, we find them by one artist dated very close together, like just even the same day or a couple days apart. So you get a sense of how many they might have done at a time.
right.
And maybe for those hymn tune booklets, it was perhaps when the student finished the hymn singing classes in school that they were given this. That's our hunch.
Makes sense. There is a question about the portrait of Friedrich der Dritt. Is it not of Frederick II's grandfather, Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg?
I would love it if one of our colleagues of Prussian or Russian Mennonite descent could answer that question. There's confusion in the early sources I looked at, including Sauer's Almanac of 1732. Sauer calls him Friedrich III. That painting I showed you, I think he's titled Friedrich II. Now, which of those two was Frederick the Great? I think the image that's being portrayed in the portrait that we have here, the 1770 portrait, I think that's Frederick the Great. But there might be some other person listening who can answer that better. But I do know that in old literature, the designation of the second or the third is sometimes confused historically.
Okay, so Wayne Strasberg has to say that Frederick I was the first king of Prussia, and Frederick II of Prussia was also known as Frederick the Great. So Frederick II was Frederick the Great. That's what Wayne is saying.
That's what I thought. But again, in Sauer's Almanac of 1762, he's called Frederick III. So is it a different Frederick or the same? I'm not sure. I can't answer that. Maybe someone else can.
Okay, and then let's see. Oh, back when you were showing one of the Bibles that had the extra Old Testament part, Mervyn was wondering if that was
I see Merv Horst just put up a link to on Wikipedia to Frederick the Great.
Okay. Mervyn was wondering, was that the Apocrypha?
Now, again, in which Bible was?
With the very first Bible you showed, where it talked about the extra Old Testament bit along with the New Testament.
So, yeah, I would have to go back. I think it was more than the Apocrypha that they were including in that second part.
Okay.
So it said, "Das andere Teil des Alten Testaments," and I don't have it in front of me. And I know Merv. I know he wants to know these details. Yeah, so it was more than just the Apocrypha that was from the last of the Old Testament that was included. And I think that had to do with how these, the scholars in the Reformation, how and when they got these various books of the Bible printed, in what order, translated, in what order they got them translated, and then when a publisher, a substantial printer publisher could get them together into one printing, into one binding. And that sometimes, there's a whole sequence of events there, particularly with the Fraktur Bible. I know that's the case. And you can read about the Fraktur Bible on Wikipedia or on Gameo. There's lots of good stuff about the Fraktur, Christopher Fraktur and his Bibles and his printing house.
And then someone else is asking, Friedrich der Gross, he brought potatoes to Germany. Is that true?
Oh, you mean he introduced potatoes to Germany?
Probably.
Okay. I never heard that. That sounds really interesting.
Okay. Okay. Yes. The Amish use the Apocrypha Tobit at their weddings. Is from Merv. Yeah. Okay, and then Wayne has another contribution about the problem is that Hohenzollern electors
Yep.
of Brandenburg became kings of Prussia and then began to renumber their names.
That's a part of the historical problem with their number designation.
Okay, and then Verna is asking how to spell Fraktur.
Yeah, Fraktur in German. If it can be spelled in English, Fractur, but
Okay,
usually it's a German word, so we spell it in German.
right. That's great. Those are the questions I see. Let me just check the Q&A. Joel is wondering, Mennonites and Schwenkfelders lived in proximity. Is there evidence of Fraktur style influence going back and forth?
Yes, and who's asking that?
Joel Clemmer.
I know Joel. I think Joel can answer that question, actually. Yes, I think he's a serious Fraktur scholar. So
Oh, okay.
I believe there was influence going back and forth in certain Schwenkfelder families and Mennonite families, particularly where I know in Skippack and Worcester, where a family of Schwenkfelder school teachers apparently lived near a family of Mennonite school teachers. We see cross-fertilization of influence back and forth, definitely.
Nice. Doreen Clausen is wondering, in the Madonna and child paintings, the presumed model shows the Madonna wearing a head covering, but the Mennonite painting does not have a head covering. I'm wondering about these differences.
Oh, in the Fraktur piece I showed, it seems to just show her hair.
Right.
I think so. Whereas what we think might be the image source in the printed source in that 1825 Bible, she does have a veil or something on. So I don't know how to answer that.
Okay. Do you see, and Brian is wondering, do we see any Fraktur from the Quakers?
Yeah, I guess we don't call it Fraktur, but yes, there are illuminated manuscript writings from Quaker families. I've seen a few. Again, family registers. There's another tradition of the love knot that I think comes maybe from the Quaker tradition, or at least from the English tradition. Yeah, I think there are, there is folk art in English speaking church, maybe sectarian traditions more so than the high church traditions.
Okay.
I've seen a few.
And Gwen is wondering, where does the tradition of Fraktur come, and what makes Fraktur Fraktur?
So the word Fraktur is kind of shorthand for this folk art form, which we could call, well, it's an illuminated manuscript. It's a type of calligraphy. It's a German calligraphy. It comes from, the name comes from the font, the print font, also called Fraktur, that was used in early, until the late 19th century, commonly used in German language printing. The word Fraktur or Frakturschriften we think it means fractured or broken writing, because the lines, I don't know if you can still see this image, the letters have these angular lines and breaks and slants to them. So it's a printing font that goes back at least, I don't know, to the 15th century, 16th century. The practice of illuminating religious manuscripts goes way back in Christian, in Catholicism and Christian history, Judeo-Christian history. I think there's probably other people listening who can answer that even better, but illuminated religious writings is an ancient tradition. Now, what we don't quite understand is how this art form may have moved from the monks working in the monastery, hand copying scripture texts, how this may have become more of a folk art form used by the schoolmasters eventually here in Pennsylvania. That's a bigger leap. I don't fully understand that, and there's been lots of speculation about that and writing about that.
Okay, that's great. Erica wonders, do color and motif give any hints as to who did the pieces?
Are you referring specifically to the gender of the creator, or just...
Or like when you talked about, you recognize that a certain author
attributions, yes.
Yeah.
Once we, again, sometimes it's through accidental discovery, or sometimes more rarely through deliberate research, we discover the name of a person, the name of an artist, because they may have very rarely signed a piece or initialed a piece, or we find some other manuscript source, which in the case of David Culp we found purely by accident. We found his school teacher's copybook from about 1805, and there we saw his name over and over again with his writing both in German script and in English, clearly, very clearly signed and dated, and that was a breakthrough to identify his hand and his style. But it's often by comparing the German script in some signed manuscript by a school teacher, comparing that to the German script on many unsigned pieces of Fraktur that are from the right place and the right time, the right community. Right. It all comes together through local history, genealogical, artistic research. It's a combination of research to piece it together, and sometimes it's just accidental discoveries, and then you work at confirming it or proving it.
Right. Sounds like a lot of details to keep in your head. Do you ever wake up in the middle of the night with, aha, I know who made that piece?
I mean, not lately, but my wife will say I used to do that. But yeah, once you learn a person's handwriting and also their Fraktur style and their motifs, their favorite motifs, it becomes easier to recognize and attribute pieces, but it's not always clear. It's not always clear.
Okay, someone is wondering, I don't know if you're going to answer this question or not. Maybe you'll want to tell the person privately. Frank is wondering how much was paid for that Bible at auction. Is that a secret?
For the Fraktur Bible?
Yes.
Let's see. We paid. Actually, I don't think we paid that much compared to. There's a couple other pieces I showed you that we paid a whole lot more for than that Bible. But to us, it was so important at that time. I can't describe the excitement that caused for us here when that Bible came up on auction. We just knew we had to save it. There's things that come up where you think we got to save it. We'll try and save it, but no, we can't raise the money. That piece we said, and that was right when we were opening this building in the fall of 1990. In the midst of all that hecticness, this piece came up, or soon after that, and we said, we must save this. We must get it. And so we just called people and pulled the money together, and we saved it.
So was it thousands?
Yeah. The Bible itself, I'll say the Bible itself, again, the auctioneer had pulled out the family register, had snipped it loose from the Bible. It wasn't hard to do that. Had pulled it out and sold the family register as a separate lot, Bibles a separate lot, one right after the other. We knew we had to buy both. You couldn't buy one and not the other. You couldn't. So the Bible, I think we paid $2,000 for, and I won't tell you how much was paid for the family register. It was more than that, a good bit more than that.
Wow. Great.
And I'll just say this: the piece I showed you, I didn't stay long with it. The piece by Henry Brauchtizer from 1787 that was signed or initialed by him very clearly on the back. That piece we knew about for several years. It was in a private collection. I actually had it on loan here for a while, and then the owner of it decided to sell it, and she gave it to an antique dealer who brokered it a limited access auction. There were two of us, literally two of us, who were given the opportunity to bid on that forschrift. and we bought it, and I will not tell you how much we paid for it.
A lot of money.
A lot. We bought it. And to be quite honest, in recent years, we don't have much of a budget for buying things. We have to be very careful about that. But we do have a special Fraktur acquisition fund and conservation fund that people occasionally contribute to. It's there. It's a line item in our budget. It's a separate fund, and people do. We have a couple of members who almost annually contribute to that fund. And so it allows us to buy 1 or 2 pieces of Fraktur a year that come up on auction or are sold privately.
Wow. Tina says that last year when she was with the Anabaptist tour, she had the opportunity to go into an antique bookstore and was able to buy several old Bibles and also a 1611 Alspawn songbook.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, that was in Europe?
Tina, we're assuming that's in Europe.
Yeah.
You can put in the chat. Yeah, probably. And Carol says, I'm a descendant of Christopher Sauer. In the Bibles he printed, there are many Frakturs. Do you have any idea who designed or drew them?
She might be referring to the 1748 Martyr's Mirror, which sometimes have Fraktur done by celibates at the Ephrata cloister. We have in our collection, we have lots of Sauer Bibles of all 3 editions. We have probably 15 of them.
Wow.
The 3 different editions. They were around here. They were the favorite pulpit Bible. I'm talking now about Christopher Sauer, not Froschauer.
Right.
It's 2 different printers in 2 different centuries. But the Sauer Bible was the favorite pulpit Bible used here in local Mennonite congregations. So that's why we have so many of them.
Okay.
And a couple of ours have inscriptions in them or family records. But if they came from families, if they came from congregations, then there's just an inscription of, if anything, there's an inscription of ownership of the congregation.
Okay.
But I'm not familiar with many Sauer Bibles that have like an elaborate Fraktur book plate.
So maybe it was a misunderstanding with the
Fraktur. Might know of some others.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some.
So Tina does clarify it was in Bern, Switzerland, where she got her books.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, we'll just have 2 last questions here. Can you comment on the connection between Fraktur pieces and the show towels and samplers made by Amish Mennonite young women?
Well, I can comment on some design connections between, at least in our area, between what we find on Mennonite, decorated textiles and Fraktur. I've referred to 1 or 2 of them. So around here in southeastern PA, Mennonite girls would do what we call show towels or decorated hand towels, which were for display on their bedroom doors, we think. But they were made often generally before marriage, in anticipation of marriage, where they kind of were showing off their needlework skills or advertising their needlework skills. And on the Mennonite show towels especially, and I think on Amish decorated textiles in Lancaster County, I've seen this too. A common motif is includes this phrase I mentioned, O edel Herz bedenk dein End, but then it has a whole design that goes with those words that I can't describe, or can't even show here now because I don't have that image, but it's this unusual needlework motif that includes a heart or 2 and a crown, and coming out of that crown and heart are blossoms which indicate good work. So and then it's surrounded by the phrase or the initials which represent that phrase that I just gave, O edel Herz bedenk dein End, O noble heart, consider your end. So there is some of this carryover in design work, a little bit between Fraktur, but of course Fraktur is a paper-based art. Textile-based needlework it's a different art form. It's a different art form.
So some connections, but different. Okay, and the final question from Linwood is, do you have more recent Fraktur style works that current folks are creating?
Yes, and I went a little too long with the historical part, but I was going to show 1 or 2 more recent pieces. Yes, in our community here today, and also in the Lancaster County Mennonite community, and not just in the Mennonite community. There are artists who are still practicing Fraktur. In our area, I think here in Montgomery, Bucks County, we have, maybe 3 or 4 Mennonite artists who are still practicing. One in particular is Roma Jacobs Ruth, John Ruth's spouse. She does very fine work, which her work is strongly influenced by the knowledge and preferences of her husband. I think her use of color and design often comes from historic pieces from our community, and she's particularly good at that. And yeah, there's a few other Mennonite artists in our area who are still practicing Fraktur, and there's 1 or 2 that have kind of retired. But there are other than Mennonite artists who are doing Fraktur in southeastern PA. There's probably a dozen, at least, who take commissions and who sell their work either by commission or prints of their work in shops or note cards.
That's great. Some people are mentioning in the chat also female Fraktur artists that they know. So
Mm-hmm.
Melinda,
there were
Esch, Barbara Eversole.
Yes. Barbara Eversole was an Amish artist in Lancaster County. In Bucks County, here we had at least 1 female teacher artist that we know of. I don't think she was a Mennonite, Barbara Dieterle. She's not known outside of Bucks County, but her work, 1820s, 1830s, is very fine and quite colorful.
That's great. Okay, I think we are going to call it an evening. This has been terrific, Joel. It's just amazing to hear you talk about this artwork and the artifacts in the center. I can tell you love your work. You just glow with passion when you start talking about these things and solving the mysteries and the discoveries you've made.
That's part of the fun when researching Fraktur. Sometimes we go for decades with just struggling to figure out who a particular artist might have been, and we don't find anything. And then every once in a while, there's kind of this breakthrough with an accidental discovery of some other document.
That's terrific. So everyone, as we wrap up, thank you again for coming. And Tour Imagination also wants to invite you to the YouTube premiere tomorrow night of John L. Ruth's documentary, Is There a Lesson?, which was filmed. It's decades of film footage and photographs from his heritage tours over about 45 years that he did with Tour Imagination, taking North Americans to explore their heritage in Europe and around the world. In the chat, you will see some place where you can go and a link to see John's film tomorrow night, and I will also put it in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow, along with a link to this evening's presentation. Joel, thank you again.
Yeah.
That was,
and thanks again
fantastic.
to Tour Imagination for coming up with this idea and coordinating it and hosting it. This has been good.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay.